I'm Franklin. They called it the Golden Mile, the New York docks. If the streets of Manhattan are the city's face, the waterfront is its gut. In the early 1950s, the piers of New York and New Jersey were the busiest, wealthiest, and deadliest miles of shoreline on Earth. Thousands of tons of cargo, silk, scotch, coffee, and gold, flowed through the docks every hour. But there was a hidden tax on every crate, a tax paid in blood to the men who controlled the hooks. This wasn't just organized crime. It was a shadow empire, and at the throne of this empire sat the Lord High Executioner himself, Albert Anastasia, a man who turned the New York docks into a conveyor belt for corpses. The shape of the silence. To a tourist, the docks were a symphony of steam whistles and shouting men. To a longshoreman, they were a labyrinth of fear. The International Longshoremen's Association, ILA, wasn't a union. It was a front for the Gambino and Genovese families. If you wanted to work, you paid a kickback. If you talked to the cops, you didn't come home for dinner. The phrase D&D, deaf and dumb, was the golden rule of the waterfront. Men saw bodies falling between ships and piers. They saw crates of luxury goods being loaded into private trucks in the middle of the night. They saw phantom employees, names on the payroll who never touched a hook but collected a full salary. And they said nothing, because they knew about the short drop. The architecture of disappearance. Albert Anastasia and his crew, the remnants of the infamous Murder, Inc., perfected the art of the vanishing act. They didn't just kill people, they deleted them from reality. In the back of the derelict warehouses on Pier 58, there were rooms that the sun never reached. This is where the syndicate dealt with troublemakers, honest dock workers who tried to report theft, or rival mobsters trying to muscling in. The methods were industrial. One notorious technique involved the very cargo they handled. Large oil drums were brought in. The victim was placed inside, often still alive, and then filled with quick-setting industrial cement used for pier repairs. Once the block was solid, it was taken out on a garbage scow or a private tugboat in the dead of night. They called them Brooklyn nightcaps or cement overcoats. When the drum hit the dark waters of the upper New York Bay, it didn't just sink. It became part of the geography. To this day, the silt at the bottom of the Hudson is said to be a graveyard of concrete cylinders, a silent city of the disappeared. The disappearance of Peter Panto. The most chilling example of the syndicate's power was the case of Peter Panto. He was a young, charismatic Italian dock worker who grew tired of seeing his friends starved out by the mob's shape-up system. He started holding meetings. He spoke of dignity. He spoke of a clean union. In July 1939, Panto left his home to meet two men. He was never seen again. The investigation went cold immediately. Why? Because the waterfront was a fortress. The police couldn't find a single witness among 5,000 dock workers. It took years for a mob informant, Abe Kid Twist Reyes, to reveal the truth. Panto had been taken to a house, strangled, and buried in a lime pit in New Jersey. The message was sent and received. The docks belonged to the hooks, the Lord High Executioner's kingdom. By 1952, Albert Anastasia had officially taken over the Gambino family. He operated out of a clothing store and various social clubs near the water. He was a man of explosive violence, known to order a hit just because someone looked at him the wrong way in a barber shop. But his true power was the economy of the port. He controlled the loading racket. If a shipping company wanted their fruit to be unloaded before it rotted on the deck, they paid Anastasia. If a construction firm needed steel, They paid Anastasia. He was the ghost in the machine of American commerce. The FBI was watching, but they were paralyzed. The docks were a closed loop. No one talked, no one saw, and the bodies kept feeding the tides. But the wind was shifting. A young priest named Father John Corridan was beginning to walk the piers, talking to the men in the shadows. A journalist was sharpening his pencil, and the syndicate, in its supreme arrogance, was about to commit a series of murders that would finally bring the light of a grand jury down into the dark holds of the ships. The docks were about to bleed, and this time, the ocean wouldn't be deep enough to hide the mess. The sun never seemed to rise fully over the Brooklyn docks. Even at noon, the piers were shrouded in a gray haze of coal smoke and fear. But the horror began every morning at 6:30 a.m. with a ritual known as the shape-up. Imagine 2,000 men standing in a semicircle on the cobblestones, freezing in the biting wind. They are strong men, fathers, veterans of the war. They stand silent, eyes fixed on a single figure standing on a crate. The hiring boss. The hiring boss was the gatekeeper. He didn't look at resumes. He looked for loyalty. He would point a finger, you, and hand out small brass checks or wooden toothpicks. These were the tickets to a day's wage. If you didn't get a pick, you didn't eat. And to get a pick, you had to kick back a portion of your pay to the union, buy tickets to mob-run charity dinners that didn't exist, and most importantly, keep your mouth shut about what you saw in the cargo holds. The brother of the executioner, while Albert Anastasia sat on the high throne of the Gambino family, the day-to-day terror of the Brooklyn waterfront, was managed by his brother, Anthony Tough Tony Anastasia. Tony didn't hide in the shadows. He ruled Pier 1 to Pier 6 like a feudal lord. He was a loud, violent man who boasted that he could stop every ship in the harbor with a single whistle. He stripped the cargo hooks of honest labor and replaced them with a system of extortion. Under Tony's watch, accidents were common. If a dock worker started asking where the union dues were going, a crate of machinery might accidentally swing loose from a crane and crush him. Or he might slip and fall between the hull of a freighter and the dock, a fatal plunge into the freezing, oily water where the propellers churned. The police would call it death by misadventure. The workers knew it was death by questioning. The priest in the trench coat. But in the midst of this industrial purgatory, a voice emerged from the unlikeliest of places, the pulpit. Father John Corridan, a Jesuit priest at St. Xavier's Church in Manhattan, declared war on the syndicate. He wasn't a soft-spoken man of the cloth. He was a tall, rugged, chain-smoking Irishman with a voice like a foghorn and a face carved from granite. He walked the docks in a long trench coat, looking more like a noir detective than a priest. Corridan knew he couldn't fight the mob with prayers alone. He fought them with facts. He organized secret meetings in the church basement, teaching the longshoremen about their rights, about economics, and about dignity. "Christ is in the shape-up," he would thunder during his sermons. "He is standing there in the cold with you, and every time the mob takes a kickback from a starving family, they are crucifying him again." He was the waterfront priest. The mob hated him. They called him the communist priest, threw rocks through his windows, and threatened his life daily. But they couldn't touch him. Killing a priest would bring down a level of heat that even Albert Anastasia couldn't survive. The blood on the crate. The tension snapped in late 1952. A brave hiring stevedore who refused to play by the mob's rules was found beaten to death with cargo hooks behind a warehouse in Hoboken. It wasn't just a murder. It was a message written in gore. But instead of silencing the workers, it enraged them. Father Corridan used the tragedy to rally the press. He spoke to a young investigative journalist named Malcolm Johnson, whose series of articles, Crime on the Waterfront, began to peel back the layers of corruption for the public to see. For the first time, the deaf and dumb rule was challenged. The New York State Crime Commission announced a massive hearing. They were going to drag the rats out of the hull and into the light. Albert Anastasia watched from his high-security mansion in New Jersey. He realized that the waterfront priest had done the impossible. He had turned the sheep into wolves. The syndicate was exposed. And when a criminal empire is exposed, it begins to eat its own. The Lord High Executioner was about to find out that loyalty on the docks costs exactly as much as the highest bidder is willing to pay. By 1957, the waterfront was boiling. The investigations launched by Father Corridan and the Crime Commission had cracked the stone wall of silence. Dock workers were talking. The books were being opened. For the Commission, the ruling body of the American Mafia, Albert Anastasia had become a liability. Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, was growing unstable. He was selling memberships to the mob like lottery tickets, inflating his ranks with mercenaries. He was shouting threats that were being picked up by FBI wiretaps. Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino, the cunning strategists of the underworld, came to a silent agreement. The Mad Hatter had to go. The docks brought him power, but they also brought him too much light. And in the underworld, light is fatal. A morning routine. On the morning of October 25th, 1957, Albert Anastasia woke up in his expansive home in New Jersey. He felt secure. He was the boss of the Gambino family, then known as the Anastasia family. He drove his dark blue sedan into Manhattan, parking near the Park Sheraton Hotel on 7th Avenue. He wasn't there for business. He was there for a bit of grooming. He walked into the hotel's barber shop, a place of marble floors, hushed conversations, and the smell of bay rum. It was a sanctuary of civilization, far from the grime of the Brooklyn piers. Anastasia sat in chair number 4. He loosened his tie. His bodyguard, Anthony Coppola, parked the car and then decided to take a walk, a convenient absence that has fueled conspiracy theories for decades. The barber, Joseph Bocchino, draped a hot towel over Anastasia's face. The Lord High Executioner closed his eyes, surrounded by steam and silence. The execution. At 10:20 a.m., 2 men entered the shop. They wore scarves covering the lower half of their faces and fedoras pulled low. They didn't speak. They walked past the manicurist, past the shoe shiner, and stopped behind chair number 4. The shoe shine boy later said they moved like dancers. The silence shattered instantly. The 2 men pulled out .38 caliber revolvers and opened fire. The first shots hit Anastasia in the hand and the hip. What happened next became a legend of mob lore. Anastasia didn't just die. Even under a hail of bullets, his instinct to fight was primal. He lunged out of the chair, crashing into the large mirrors in front of him. In his disorientation and shock, he thought the reflections of the gunmen were the men themselves. He shattered the glass, swinging at ghosts, while the real killers stood behind him, continuing to fire. A final bullet struck him in the back of the head. The one-man army collapsed to the tiled floor. The hot towel, now soaked in blood, lay beside him. The gunmen dropped their weapons, or fled with them, accounts vary, and vanished into the bustling midtown crowd, disappearing into the subway system. They left behind a corpse that marked the end of an era. The vacuum. The murder of Albert Anastasia was an earthquake. It wasn't just a hit, it was a regime change. With Anastasia gone, the terrifying grip on the waterfront didn't loosen. It just changed hands. Carlo Gambino took over the family, ushering in an era of business rather than butchery. The crude methods of cement shoes and open brawls were replaced by more sophisticated forms of racketeering. But on that morning in the Park Sheraton, the image of the feared boss lying dead in a pile of broken glass and shaving cream sent a message to every stevedore and union boss in New York. No one is untouchable, not even the devil himself. The docks had lost their king, but the machine was still running. And down in the silt of the Hudson River, the concrete blocks were still settling, silent monuments to the brutal reign that had just ended. The bullets that killed Albert Anastasia in the Park Sheraton Hotel didn't just end a life. They shattered the secrecy of the American Mafia forever. The chaotic power vacuum left by his death forced the mob bosses to call a massive summit in Appalachian, New York, just 3 weeks later to sort out the leadership. That meeting was raided by state troopers. For the first time, the FBI was forced to admit that the La Cosa Nostra was real. The waterfront had dragged the monsters into the daylight. Carlo Gambino, the man who orchestrated Anastasia's fall, was a different breed of criminal. He understood that the era of the iron hook, open brutality and bodies floating in the harbor, was bad for business. Under Gambino, the waterfront rackets evolved. The violence became quiet. The cement shoes became a metaphor for corporate strangulation rather than physical drowning. The mob shifted its focus from extorting individual dock workers to controlling the shipping containers, the trucking contracts, and the construction unions that built the piers. They stopped stealing crates of whiskey and started stealing percentages of pension funds. The theft became invisible, sanitized, and infinitely more profitable. And what of the hero? Father John Corridan, the waterfront priest, who had inspired movies and Senate hearings, did not get a parade. The tragedy of the whistleblower is that institutions, even holy ones, prefer silence. The Catholic Church, uncomfortable with Corridan's celebrity and his aggressive tactics against powerful union leaders, promoted him out of New York. In 1957, the same year his nemesis Anastasia was killed, Corridan was transferred to a small college in Syracuse to teach sociology. He was removed from the docks he loved, stripped of his battlefield. He died in 1984, largely forgotten by the public. But his legacy, the Waterfront Commission, remained. A government body created to police the hiring practices he had fought against. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it broke the absolute feudalism of the shape-up. The longshoremen finally had a process, not just a prayer. The final blow to the mob's stranglehold wasn't delivered by the police, but by technology. In the 1960s, containerization arrived. The thousands of men needed to manually haul sacks of coffee and crates of bananas were replaced by massive cranes and standardized steel boxes. The chaotic, teeming, dangerous world of the manual docks vanished. The workforce shrank from 50,000 to a few thousand. The neighborhood culture of the waterfront died, and with it, the street-level power of the mob. The docks became sterile, fenced-off zones of high efficiency. Today, the Brooklyn waterfront is a place of luxury condos, parks, and artisanal coffee shops. Tourists jog along the piers where men were once beaten to death for asking for a fair wage. The warehouses where the trials took place have been converted into expensive lofts. Historians and divers know that the riverbed is a geological layer of New York's sins. Beneath the silt, rusted guns, Prohibition-era bottles, and yes, the occasional inexplicable concrete block rest in the dark. The cement shoes may have been exaggerated by Hollywood, But the reality was often grimmer. Bodies bound with wire and weighted with construction debris, dissolving into the muck. Albert Anastasia and Father Corridan were two sides of the same coin, men of absolute conviction who fought for the soul of the harbor. One used fear, the other used truth. The mob lost the battle for the streets, but they taught the world a terrifying lesson. Commerce has no morality. The goods must flow, the ships must sail, and sometimes the price of a cheap banana is a man's life, buried quietly beneath the waves. The water is calm now. The ships are gone. But if you listen closely to the lap of the tide against the old pilings, you can still hear the echo of the whistle, signaling the start of the shape-up in hell.